Ian, I certainly have wanted to know in life, is there a God? But frankly, there has been a haunting question, even more fundamental to me, as it has been to many, in that, why is there anything at all? And that's the ultimate mystery of existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? You've talked about a theology of creation from nothing. What does that mean, and how does that answer the ultimate question?
I'm not sure it does answer the ultimate question, and I must admit in that there's a famous exchange between Copleston and Russell on that question, and Russell just said, I don't find that question particularly interesting, and there's not really much, unfortunately, Copleston or others can do than bang the table back. So, I mean,
the universe is, and that's all.
The universe is. So again,
that's Russell's famous comment.
Yeah, I don't think that creation functions helpfully as an explanatory hypothesis for why the world is. I think creation reflects a Christian commitment about the relationship of God to what is not God. And what creation from nothing is trying to do is to define the character of that relationship. So it's not a temporal claim that at one time God zapped and things came in. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a t=0. It seems to me that most cosmologists believe that there is one, and that's fine, and certainly consistent with Christian belief. But what creation from nothing is saying is, God is the only antecedent condition of the world's existence. And so if you think of the phrase creation from nothing, normally if you think of creation of this chair from wood, what follows the from is the stuff out of which the entity created is made. The nothing there is designed to say that in the case of God's creation, unlike any experience of creation we have, where it's always the creator plus something else, even if it's just the ideas, the notes, the words in an author's or a musician's head, that there's something besides the creator that's contributing to the reality. Creation from nothing is saying there's nothing besides God that is the ground of the universe. It is all from God. And of course, why that's important for Christians, and I think also for Jews and Muslims, is that it means that there's finally nothing that escapes the possibility of God's redemptive power. Because there's no independent reality.
Just understand what that means. What's the alternative?
The alternative would be, for example, a Platonist understanding, what you see in Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus, where God is the orderer of a pre-existing chaos. And God makes the best out of it that God can. God takes it and tries to make it a moving image of eternity, as Plato puts it, tries to make it mirror the forms, which are eternal and changeless. But you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And so, inevitably, because you're using inferior materials, which is all that's available, matter, things fall apart. And God can't really do anything about that. There's a contemporary school of theology called process thought that argues for something like a Platonic view, and they like that view because what it means is God's not responsible for evil. Evil is sort of ingrained in the way the imperfections of the universe as it's put together. The difficulty with creation from nothing is evil is a much more intractable problem. Why doesn't God stop these things? The gambit of the tradition has been that question is indeed a penetrating and difficult one, but we have to live with it because the alternative is to give up on the hope of redemption.
And you have to start with, to have the true God with all the independent powers, you have to have that God be, can't start with anything else. I mean, everything has to proceed from that God.
If there's anything else, then whatever that else is, stands as some sort of a limit to God's power, a restraint, a constraint on what God can do. Yeah.
One of the logical objections that I've worried about are abstract objects. And this is a whole conversation, but do you have to have God create abstract objects as well? You know, the numbers, sets, theories, logic, propositions, all of these things that we talk about that some people say are non-created because they are eternal by definition.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways I would respond to that. First of all, in terms of, there are certain ways in which when we say that God can't create a contradiction, for example, I see that kind of a claim, which is perfectly okay, but I see it less as a claim about God than simply a claim about our limits on language. Once we start talking in those terms, then because contradiction, once you accept a contradiction, you can prove anything, then you've simply unhinged God talk from any connection it might have to normal discourse. In terms of the idea of God's creation well, what exactly are the limits of what God creates? Let me try to answer it this way and see if this helps. One of the ways in which creation is often conceived, I think, and I think mistakenly, because it doesn't follow the principle of from nothing, is that God has a range of possible worlds God might have created, and God chooses one. Even as I could bake a lot of things for dessert tonight, and I choose chocolate cake versus apple pie. I think that's a mistake, because possibilities, in fact, if you want to think about what in Platonic thinking, matter actually is, it's pure possibility. Possibilities are also something that in effect would limit God. God doesn't actualize one possibility among many. God creates, part of what God creates is a world in which the actualization of possibilities happens. So again, there's a radical disanalogy between any sort of way we can think about creating in our own experience and the way God creates. And so even as God doesn't choose among possibilities, but rather gives rise to the whole ensemble of the whole conceptual world that we can think of, where possibilities and actualizations are part of our experience of the world, so also...
But that's one world? That's one possible... Are you defining one possible world as the world with all possibilities in that one world?
No, I'm trying to say that the whole idea of selection among possibilities is an intra-creation reality. And that God, being transcendent, doesn't relate to God's act of creating doesn't happen that way in terms of a selection. God simply creates. And again, it's disanalogous with our notions of creation, because our notions of creation always involve a creator plus something else. And it's disanalogous because we always think of creation as a matter of selection among options. But to think about God that way is to bring God down to the level of a creaturely reality, and God's not like that.
But that sounds like you're limiting God to only one possibility.
No, because again, if you're still thinking about possibility as it were a conceptual frame within which God's acting. And what I'm trying to push is that the idea of possibility is a conceptual frame that is, as it were, sub-divine. It's part of the created order itself, and not something that God is under. So that part of what creation from nothing means, let me try it this way, is that God is not within whatever metaphysical system you want to operate within, but is above it. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that sounds good, but then we have to interpret that means. And we have a world. There's a certain relationship of the size or the mass of the electron to the mass of the proton. I mean, we have dozens, maybe a couple of dozen fundamental constants. Maybe they're reducible, maybe they're not. I mean, this is a world that we got, and there's certain principles, and maybe higher level principles of chaos. And there's a virtually infinite number of other ways that this could have been structured. What you're saying is that all of these possibilities are within this one world that God created. But it sounds like God had there was no choice, that whatever God did,
But again, see where I want to push back. I mean, first of all, God might have created a multiverse. I mean, there's what the universe is, I'm perfectly agnostic about. So there may be, in fact, pockets where the electron and proton ratios are different than they are here. But however that may be, I don't want to say God had no choice, but I do want to say that the very logic of choosing is one where you're thinking about options and possibilities that can be actualized or not. I just want to say that framework is not one that rightly applies to God. And that's because of the character of creation as being so absolute, of it really involving nothing else. Let me put it this way. Creation from nothing means not simply there's God and no matter, but God and no possibilities. Not in the sense that therefore God had to do it one way rather than another, but that we just can't think about what it means for God being God to create, because all our experience of creation is always in the middle of the world where we have other factors that are in play.
That's fair. But still, you have a particular world, even if that world has lots of possibilities within it, and there are other ways that this could have happened, and you're saying that God had no choice. I can't get away from that.
I'm not saying that God had no choice. Well, first of all, the fundamental God didn't have to create it all. Okay,
all right.
There's that element. Creation itself is understood as gracious.
Okay,
but when one conceives of what is God doing when God creates, part of the challenge of creation from nothing, as a conceptual premise is to say that God's act of creating is fundamentally other than any experience we have of creating. And so if you're saying that, then the idea that it could have been otherwise. Yeah, within the world, all kinds of other possibilities might be realized even within the world we have, right? I might not have ever been born. My parents may never have met. All kinds of things.
Yeah, but that has to do with the local structure of the world and probabilistics and all of that within this world.
Right.
But that's one total state of affairs.
Right.
And you're saying the state of affairs that exists is the only one that could...
No, because the language of only one that could presupposes a framework where I'm thinking there are multiple possibilities or no possibilities. And I'm saying that the whole category of possibility is an intra-creation reality, and therefore just doesn't translate to whatever God's experience was as creator.
So what? Let me ask it this way: did God have a choice?
Yes.
He had a choice of create to not create. That I understand. But did God have a choice of the kind of thing that would be created?
See, there I think, I don't mean to be evasive, but there I think there's a category mistake that you've implicitly made, which is that there is there are several ways of thinking about possibilities, right? One is there are several possibilities, God chooses one that God prefers for whatever reason. The other is God looks at the list of possibilities and, oh dear, there's only one. Both of those still function within the same frame, and I'm saying they're both not applicable.
Okay, I mean that sounds nice, but then what is applicable?
What's applicable is the miracle of the fact that there is something rather than nothing by God's grace. But it is purely a matter of grace and not something that one can reason behind to figure out why it takes this form that it does or why it's here at all. That's simply, it is to be, for Christians, it's to be received as a gift and to be trusted because of the character we think God has as fundamentally good and gift-like rather than a torment chamber.
So you don't accept even the question that gives God any choice in what happens.
I just think that choice. It's not that God doesn't have any choice. Like, oh no, God, you couldn't have
But
done
you're giving God a choice of either create or not create.
Well, I have no other word. I have no other words to use.
So you've gone that far, right?
Fair enough. I have no other words to use to express the graciousness of creation than saying God didn't have to do it.
So we know there are at least two possibilities. We know there's one that there is a creation, one that not. And God had that grace. If God had the grace, He had that choice.
Yeah.
So if He had that choice, why didn't He have another choice?
Yeah. And I think the response is it's a fair question because we're treading at the edge of coherent discourse.
That's where I like to tread.
No, it's fine, and it's good to push there. The difficulty, of course, with choice language, even with that initial piece, is that again, choice implies Coke or Pepsi, and God's creative activity isn't God pondering what am I going to do next. When we say God creates freely, what we mean is that God was not compelled, either because of some mechanistic necessitarianism or because God needed to be fulfilled in some way to do this. So that's what the freedom of creation means. If we think of it, however, as, and again, in loose terms, we probably can't help talking this way, but if we think of it as God's imagining a possibility, I create or I don't create and choose one, then you're right, I've gotten into that same problem, and therefore I'd want to pull back from the language of choice even there.